Gunfire was supposed to be the soundtrack of his night, not the soft, trembling lips of a complete stranger. She crashed into his world like a reckless comet, pressing her mouth to his to save him from 3 armed men. Completely oblivious, she was actually saving them from him. Neon lights flickered through the rain-slicked windows of the Aviary, one of Chicago's most exclusive cocktail lounges. Vivian Clark sat at the mahogany bar, swirling a $12 glass of Pinot Noir she could barely afford. She was a junior architect at a mid-sized firm on Wacker Drive, celebrating a minor promotion that barely covered the cost of her overpriced drink. Exhaustion pulled at the corners of her hazel eyes, her tailored navy blazer feeling heavier by the minute. She just wanted to use the restroom, pay her tab, and catch the Red Line train back to her tiny apartment in Lincoln Park. Pushing herself away from the bar, Vivian navigated the labyrinth of velvet booths and dimly lit corridors. The bass of the lounge's sound system thumped against the floorboards, vibrating through the soles of her sensible black pumps. Taking a sharp left past a heavy velvet curtain, she found herself in a secluded VIP hallway that smelled of expensive cigar smoke and spilled bourbon. It was entirely empty, save for 4 men clustered near the service exit. Instinct told her to turn around. Her late brother, Thomas, had always warned her about walking into blind spots. Thomas had lost his life 3 years ago in a botched mugging in a similar alleyway, a memory that still haunted Vivian's nightmares. She froze in the shadows, her breath catching in her throat as she took in the scene playing out 20 feet away. 3 men, built like industrial refrigerators and dressed in cheap, ill-fitting leather jackets, had cornered a single man against the brick wall. The solitary man was a stark contrast to his aggressors. He wore a bespoke charcoal-grey Brioni suit that screamed old money, his dark hair slicked back perfectly, throwing sharp, angular shadows across his jawline. He looked impossibly calm, completely unbothered by the fact that the largest of the 3 thugs had a hand shoved deep into his jacket pocket, clearly gripping the handle of a concealed weapon. Panic seized Vivian's chest. The tall man in the suit was going to be robbed, or worse, killed right here in the hallway, and no one in the crowded bar would hear a thing over the thumping bass. The memory of Thomas bleeding out on the pavement flashed behind her eyes, hot and blinding. Before her rational mind could hit the brakes, a massive surge of adrenaline hijacked her nervous system. She couldn't let another innocent person die. Marching forward, the sharp clack of her heels echoing like gunshots against the hardwood floor, Vivian forced a blindingly fake smile onto her face. "Babe! Oh my God, I have been looking everywhere for you!" she squealed, pitching her voice an octave higher to mimic a heavily intoxicated, obnoxious socialite. The 3 thugs snapped their heads toward her, their expressions twisting into ugly scowls of confusion. The man in the Brioni suit blinked, his dark, piercing obsidian eyes locking onto hers. For a fraction of a second, surprise flashed across his stoic features, swiftly replaced by a dangerous, calculating amusement. Vivian didn't give anyone a chance to process her sudden arrival. She shoved past the largest thug, deliberately hitting him with her purse, and threw her arms around the tall stranger's neck. "The Uber has been waiting for 10 minutes, and you're back here talking to whoever these guys are." Before he could utter a single word, Vivian grabbed the lapels of his $1,000 suit, pulled him down to her level, and smashed her lips against his. She expected him to push her away, to shout in confusion, but instead, the stranger let out a low, vibrating hum at the back of his throat. His large, calloused hands immediately went to her waist, gripping her with a possessive strength that sent a jolt of electricity straight down her spine. The kiss, meant to be a fleeting, desperate distraction, suddenly deepened. He took complete control, tilting her head and parting her lips, tasting of expensive Macallan 18 whiskey and something dark, sharp, and metallic, like gunpowder. The sheer dominance of his response made Vivian's knees buckle, her fingers helplessly tangling in his dark hair as the world around them melted into a heated blur. Over Vivian's shoulder, Lorenzo Falcone, the undisputed head of the Chicago syndicate, snapped his eyes open. He glared at the 3 O'Rourke cartel hitmen who had been sent to assassinate him. With one subtle, sharp flick of his wrist, behind Vivian's back, Lorenzo gave his hidden sniper, perched on the fire escape outside the frosted window, the signal to stand down. He waved the 3 terrified hitmen away. Realizing that the legendary Mafia boss was willingly engaged with this lunatic woman and terrified of the sudden shift in atmosphere, the thugs scrambled backward and bolted out the service door into the rainy alley. Vivian finally broke the kiss, gasping for air, her cheeks flushed crimson. She didn't bother looking back at the men, assuming her crazy girlfriend act had sufficiently scared them off. "Come on, before they realize I'm bluffing," she hissed, grabbing Lorenzo's wrist. She dragged him down the hallway, through the bustling lounge, and shoved him out the front doors onto the wet pavement of Fulton Market. The cool autumn air hit her face, snapping her back to reality. She turned to the striking stranger, aggressively pointing a finger at his chest. "Listen to me. You cannot flash a Rolex Daytona in a dimly lit bar and wander into dark hallways by yourself. Are you insane? Those guys were going to stab you and dump you in the Chicago River. Have some street smarts." Lorenzo stood under the glowing neon sign, the rain lightly dusting his immaculate suit. He stared at the fierce, beautiful woman lecturing him, completely mesmerized. He had killed men for simply looking him in the eye for too long. Yet this tiny civilian was currently berating him on the sidewalk. "I'll keep that in mind," Lorenzo murmured, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone that sent another shiver down her spine. "Get a cab. Go straight home. Don't talk to strangers," Vivian ordered, exhausted by her own heroics. Without waiting for a thank you, she turned on her heel and marched toward the subway station, completely unaware that she had just signed her own death warrant by getting involved with the most dangerous man in the Western Hemisphere. Monday morning tasted like cheap break-room coffee and impending dread. Vivian sat at her cluttered desk at Harrison and Company Architecture, staring blankly at the blueprints of a commercial plaza. She couldn't focus. Her lips still tingled with the phantom pressure of the stranger's kiss from Saturday night. It had been the most reckless, stupid, and undeniably exhilarating moment of her entire 26 years of existence. "Hey, Viv, did you see the news?" her co-worker Sarah asked, leaning over the cubicle partition with wide eyes. Sarah spun her tablet around, displaying the front page of the Chicago Tribune. Vivian leaned in, her blood turning to ice. The headline screamed, "Brutal gang slaying in Fulton Market Alley." Below the text was a gritty crime scene photograph showing 3 body bags being loaded into a coroner's van. "3 guys tied to the O'Rourke mob," Sarah whispered, shivering. "Found dead right behind the aviary lounge. Weren't you drinking there on Saturday?" The lukewarm coffee in Vivian's stomach threatened to make a violent reappearance. She recognized the cheap leather jacket peeking out from beneath one of the yellow tarps. It was them. The 3 men who had cornered the handsome stranger. They hadn't been muggers. They were mobsters. And if they were mobsters, who exactly was the man she had kissed? Before Vivian could process the horrifying reality of her situation, a heavy, suffocating silence descended over the bustling open-plan office. The familiar hum of ringing phones and clacking keyboards abruptly died. Vivian looked up. Outside the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of their Vaca Drive office, a convoy of 3 sleek, pitch-black Maybachs had illegally parked on the sidewalk. 4 men in tailored black suits stepped out, their postures rigid, eyes scanning the street with military precision. They walked through the revolving doors of the lobby, completely bypassing the frantic security guard. The glass doors of Harrison and Company swung open, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Standing at the threshold was the man from the hallway. In the harsh daylight of the office, Lorenzo Falcone looked even more intimidating. He wore a midnight blue 3-piece suit, a heavy gold watch glinting on his wrist. The aura of raw, predatory power radiating from him was so intense that several junior draftsmen physically backed away from their desks. Mr. Harrison, the balding, overweight owner of the firm, scrambled out of his corner office, sweating profusely. "Mr. Falcone, I didn't expect you until this afternoon to sign the acquisition papers." Vivian stopped breathing. Acquisition papers? Falcone. The name echoed in her mind like a death knell. Everyone in Chicago knew the name Falcone. They owned the ports, the unions, the casinos, and half the politicians. Lorenzo completely ignored the babbling architect. His dark, dangerous eyes swept across the room with lethal precision until they locked onto Vivian. A slow, terrifyingly beautiful smirk curved his lips. The moment his gaze found hers, the rest of the world ceased to exist. He bypassed Mr. Harrison, his expensive leather shoes echoing ominously against the hardwood floor. He walked straight into the labyrinth of cubicles, stopping directly in front of Vivian's desk. The 3 massive bodyguards fanned out behind him, silently daring anyone in the office to make a sudden movement. "You didn't leave a number," Lorenzo stated, his deep voice carrying perfectly through the dead, silent room. Vivian swallowed hard, her trembling hands instinctively gripping the edges of her desk. "You're Lorenzo Falcone." "I am," he replied smoothly, leaning forward to rest his large hands on her desk, invading her personal space. The intoxicating scent of cedar and expensive cologne washed over her. "And you are Vivian Clark. You live in a 3rd-floor walk-up in Lincoln Park. You owe $30,000 in student loans, and you have a terrible habit of throwing yourself into the middle of cartel assassinations." "I thought you were being mugged," she whispered fiercely, her survival instinct finally kicking in. "I was trying to save your life." "You ruined a perfectly good execution," Lorenzo corrected, his tone conversational, yet layered with deadly serious undertones. "Those men were sent by Jimmy O'Rourke to put a bullet in my head. I had my sniper perfectly aligned to take them out. And then you skipped down the hallway, claimed me as your boyfriend, and kissed me in front of the Irish mob." Vivian's face drained of color. "Oh my God. The news. They're dead." "Yes," Lorenzo said simply. "But before they died, they reported back to Jimmy. They told him that Lorenzo Falcone, a man who has famously never allowed a woman to get close to him, has a secret girlfriend who is brave enough to scream at hitmen. Do you understand what that means, Vivian?" She shook her head, tears of sheer panic pricking her eyes. "It means the O'Rourke family now believes you are my only weakness," Lorenzo murmured, reaching out. His gloved thumb gently brushed a stray lock of hair behind her ear, the touch surprisingly tender for a man with so much blood on his hands. "They have put a $2 million bounty on your beautiful head. If I leave you in this office, you will be dead before your lunch break." "No," Vivian gasped, stepping back, bumping her chair into the partition. "No, this is a mistake. I'll go to the police. The police work for me," Lorenzo interrupted calmly. He stood to his full, towering height, buttoning his suit jacket. "I bought this firm 20 minutes ago to secure this building. You don't work for Harrison anymore. You belong to me now. My men are currently packing your apartment. You are moving into my estate on the North Shore." "You can't just kidnap me," Vivian hissed, glancing desperately at her co-workers, who were all staring at their shoes, utterly terrified to intervene. Lorenzo stepped into her space, his chest brushing against hers. He leaned down, his lips grazing her ear. "You claimed me in that hallway, Vivian. You kissed the devil in front of his enemies. I am the only thing keeping you breathing right now. So grab your coat, sweetheart. We have a war to win." Rain battered the tinted bulletproof windows of the Maybach as it glided through the massive wrought-iron gates of the Falcone estate in Highland Park. Vivian sat rigidly against the pristine white leather interior, her fingers tightly interwoven in her lap to hide their violent trembling. Beside her, Lorenzo radiated a dark, unyielding calmness, answering brief, coded messages on a burner phone. He had essentially abducted her from her mundane corporate life just hours ago. Yet he treated the situation with the casual indifference of a man rescheduling a dinner reservation. Towering limestone walls loomed ahead, framing a sprawling mansion that looked more like a modern fortress than a home. Armed guards dressed in tactical gear patrolled the manicured grounds, assault rifles slung casually over their shoulders. Vivian swallowed the hard knot in her throat. This was not a temporary safe house. This was an empire, and she was its newest, most vulnerable captive. "Breathe, Vivian," Lorenzo commanded softly, not even glancing up from his phone. "If I wanted you harmed, you would have never made it out of that alley on Saturday. Forgive me if being dragged into a Mafia war by a ruthless crime boss doesn't exactly put me at ease," Vivian snapped, her fear rapidly transforming into a sharp, defensive anger. "My entire life is back in that city. My job, my friends, my brother's grave. You can't just erase my existence because your enemies saw me kiss you." Lorenzo finally lowered the device, his obsidian eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her breath hitch. "Your existence was already erased the moment you stepped into my crosshairs. Jimmy O'Rourke does not leave loose ends. He tortures them. He skins them alive to send a message. You are here because these walls are the only things standing between you and a shallow grave in the Pine Barrens." Before she could formulate a retort, the car rolled to a smooth halt in front of the grand entrance. A man waiting on the limestone steps pulled the door open. He was older, with silver hair at his temples and a tailored charcoal suit, possessing a dangerous grace that mirrored Lorenzo's. "Matteo, my underboss," Lorenzo introduced curtly, stepping out into the cold drizzle and offering Vivian his hand. She ignored it, climbing out on her own, though her sensible work heels slipped slightly on the wet pavement. Lorenzo's hand shot out, gripping her waist with bruising, possessive speed to steady her. "Welcome to the Gilded Cage, Miss Clark," Matteo said, his voice gravelly, lacking any real warmth. "We have secured your perimeter. However, we have a slight complication. Detective Sean Gallagher from the Chicago PD Major Crimes Division was sniffing around her apartment building while our men were packing her things." Lorenzo's jaw clenched, a muscle feathering furiously in his cheek. "Gallagher is on O'Rourke's payroll. If he was at her apartment, Jimmy already has her address. Burn the apartment. Erase her financial footprint. Vivian Clark died of a sudden gas leak this afternoon." "Are you insane?" Vivian shrieked, shoving hard against Lorenzo's chest. It was like pushing a brick wall. "You can't blow up my home. Everything I own is in there. Pictures of my brother, my family." "Your brother, Thomas," Lorenzo interrupted, his voice dropping to a dangerously low decibel. He gripped her wrists, easily subduing her frantic struggling, and pulled her flush against his chest. "Let's talk about Thomas, shall we? Because your heroic little intervention at the aviary wasn't the first time your family crossed paths with the Chicago underworld." Vivian froze, the fight draining from her muscles. "What are you talking about? Thomas was killed in a random mugging. He was an accountant." "He was a forensic accountant," Lorenzo corrected, guiding her forcefully up the steps and into the cavernous, marble-floored foyer of the mansion. And 3 years ago, his firm was contracted to audit a shell company operating out of the South Side, a company owned by Jimmy O'Rourke. Thomas found $3 million in laundered cartel money. He was going to take it to the feds. The opulent surroundings blurred around Vivian. The massive crystal chandelier above them seemed to sway violently. "No, the police said it was a robbery. They took his wallet, his watch. They took his silence," Lorenzo said, his tone softening just a fraction, recognizing the devastating shock breaking across her face. Gallagher was the lead detective on that case. He buried the evidence, framed it as a street crime, and O'Rourke paid him handsomely for it. Tears spilled over Vivian's lashes, hot and stinging. For 3 years, she had carried the agonizing guilt of her brother's death, wishing she had walked him home, wishing the city was safer. Now, the truth laid bare before her was infinitely more horrifying. Her brother was murdered to protect a monster's fortune. "Why are you telling me this?" Her voice cracked, echoing hollowly in the massive foyer. Lorenzo reached out, his leather-clad thumb wiping a tear from her pale cheek. The gesture was shockingly intimate, completely at odds with the violent world he commanded. "Because you looked at me in that alley and decided my life was worth saving. You are loyal, Vivian, and you are fierce, but you are blind to the monsters circling you. I need you to understand exactly who we are fighting. Jimmy O'Rourke took your blood. He tried to take my life." Matteo cleared his throat from the doorway, holding up a ringing encrypted tablet. "Boss, it's Jimmy. He's demanding a parley." Lorenzo's eyes never left Vivian's. The terrifying, beautiful smirk returned to his lips, but this time it was laced with a chilling promise of absolute violence. "Accept it. Tell him I'll meet him at the old shipyard, and tell him to bring his coffin." Midnight cloaked the abandoned naval shipyard in absolute suffocating darkness. The rusted husks of decommissioned freighters loomed against the stormy Chicago skyline like iron leviathans. Vivian crouched behind a stack of rotting wooden shipping crates, the freezing wind slicing through the oversized cashmere coat Lorenzo had draped over her shoulders hours ago. She wasn't supposed to be here. She was supposed to be locked securely inside the Highland Park estate. But betrayal always struck from the inside. Carter, one of the elite guards Lorenzo had assigned to her bedroom door, had dragged her out through the estate service tunnels at gunpoint just an hour after Lorenzo left for the parley. Carter had sold out to O'Rourke for a seat at the cartel's table, bringing Vivian to the shipyard as the ultimate bargaining chip to force Lorenzo's surrender. However, Carter had severely underestimated the woman he kidnapped. Vivian was an architect. She spent her days analyzing structures, identifying load-bearing weaknesses, and mapping out spatial environments. When Carter pushed her into the decaying warehouse overlooking the docks, Vivian immediately noticed the compromised structural integrity of the rusted steel catwalks above them. Pretending to stumble in the dark, she had kicked a heavy iron pipe against a corroded support beam, bringing a section of the catwalk crashing down between them. In the ensuing dust and chaos, she had sprinted into the labyrinth of the shipyard. Now, the sound of heavy boots crunching on gravel echoed dangerously close to her hiding spot. "Come out, little bird," Jimmy O'Rourke's voice boomed over a megaphone, the harsh, grating Irish brogue cutting through the howling wind. "Falcone is bleeding out on the docks. His empire is burning. If you walk out now, I promise to make it quick, just like I did for your nosy brother, Thomas." Rage pure and blinding overrode the crippling terror in Vivian's veins. She peeked around the rotting wood. Down by the water's edge, bathed in the harsh, blinding glare of a dozen SUV headlights, stood Jimmy O'Rourke. He was a repulsive, heavy-set man, flanked by 50 armed cartel soldiers, and kneeling on the blood-soaked concrete in the center of the illuminated circle was Lorenzo. Lorenzo's midnight blue suit was torn, his face bruised and bleeding from a nasty cut above his eyebrow. 3 of O'Rourke's men had their assault rifles pressed firmly against the back of the Mafia boss's head. Yet, even on his knees, Lorenzo looked like a king waiting for his subjects to finish their pathetic little rebellion. His dark eyes scanned the shadows, searching for something. Searching for her. "You brought a civilian to a war, Lorenzo," Jimmy sneered, pacing around the kneeling boss. "Carter is hunting her down right now. Once I put a bullet in her brain, I'll take your territories, your ports, and your life." Vivienne noticed a massive, rusted industrial crane towering directly above the illuminated standoff. The control cabin hung precariously over the cartel soldiers. Beside her crate was the secondary power breaker box, heavily rusted but still humming with faint electricity. She remembered the blueprints of these old naval yards from a revitalization project her firm had pitched last year. If she tripped the master overload, the magnetic lock on the crane's payload, a massive cluster of steel I-beams, would release. She didn't hesitate. Pulling her sleeves over her hands, Vivian lunged for the breaker box, gripping the heavy iron lever with all her strength. "Hey, she's over here!" Carter's voice screamed from her left, his gun raising to take the shot. "For Thomas," Vivian whispered, ripping the lever downward with a violent crack. Sparks showered the wet concrete. High above the docks, the crane groaned, a deafening mechanical screech that echoed across the water. The magnetic lock failed. 5 tons of reinforced steel I-beams plummeted from the sky directly into the center of O'Rourke's men. The earth-shattering impact threw everyone off their feet. Metal shrieked, the ground cratered, and a massive cloud of dust and debris engulfed the headlights. In the sudden, chaotic blindness, Lorenzo didn't miss a single beat. He moved with the terrifying speed of an apex predator off its leash. Before the dust could even begin to settle, the sharp, rhythmic cracks of Lorenzo's suppressed sidearm silenced the panicked shouts of the cartel soldiers. Vivienne pressed her back against the crate, covering her ears as the rapid gunfire echoed through the yard. Then, terrifyingly, absolute silence fell over the docks. Heavy, deliberate footsteps crunched on the gravel, approaching her crate. Vivian held her breath, squeezing her eyes shut. "You can open your eyes, Maya Regina," a deep, gravelly voice murmured. Vivian looked up. Lorenzo stood over her, his face streaked with dust and blood, but his dark eyes burned with an intoxicating, possessive fire. Behind him, the remaining cartel soldiers were fleeing into the night, leaving Jimmy O'Rourke bleeding out on the concrete, gasping his final breaths. Matteo and the syndicate reinforcements were swarming the yard, securing the perimeter. Lorenzo reached down, pulling Vivian up from the dirt. He didn't check her for injuries. He simply hauled her flush against his chest, burying his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling her scent like she was oxygen, and he had been drowning. "You dropped 5 tons of steel on my enemies," he rumbled against her skin, a dark, breathless laugh vibrating in his chest. "I told you to hide, Vivian." "I told you on Saturday," she breathed out, her arms instinctively wrapping around his broad shoulders, clinging to him. "You need street smarts to survive this city." Lorenzo pulled back just enough to look at her lips. The cold indifference of the Mafia boss was entirely gone, replaced by a consuming, devastating devotion. "You saved my life again. You avenged your brother. You own me, Vivian Clark. Every breath I take, every bullet I fire, belongs to you." He didn't wait for her to reply. Lorenzo crashed his mouth down onto hers, the kiss mirroring the violent, chaotic beauty of the night. It tasted of blood, rain, and absolute victory. Vivian tangled her fingers in his dark hair, kissing him back with an equal desperate fervor. She had walked into an alley to save a stranger, only to conquer the most dangerous man in Chicago. She was no longer just an architect. She was the newly crowned queen of the Falcone Syndicate, and they had a city to rule. Will Vivian's reign alongside Lorenzo bring peace to Chicago? Or is this just the beginning of a deadlier war? Falling in love with the devil means embracing the flames, and this Mafia queen is clearly not afraid of the fire. If you were captivated by Vivian and Lorenzo's intense romance, hit that like button, share the story with your fellow drama lovers, and don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling, real-life inspired Mafia romances.